UTS Impact Studios presents History Lab. Hey History lovers, I'm Tamsin Peach and a warm welcome to Season 6 of History Lab, Unsettling Portraits. Can colonial pictures of Indigenous people tell us anything useful about the past? How do Indigenous people feel about these images today? Unsettling Portraits is a 3-part series exploring the history of colonial portraiture and what it means to contemporary First Nations people.
I mean, I look at that image and for me, it's ridiculous. You know. Sorry.
You'll hear Indigenous artists and historians in Australia, the Pacific and North America on the practice of colonial portraiture. People like Daniel Browning, Joe Ray, Alice Tapanga Somerville, Gordon Henry and Joseph Pearce. And they'll talk about the ways in which contemporary artists like Daniel Boyd, Michael Tuffery and the late Destiny Deacon have turned back the gaze on settlers with their art. Think Captain No-Beard and Cookie in the Islands. Join acclaimed historians Kate Fullagar and Mike McDonnell as they wrestle with the portraits of our colonial past in History Lab Season 6, Unsettling Portraits.
It's the things that he's lacking that I find most interesting. The tattoos and the ochre paint.
For me, what I'm seeing is the interpretation of the white colonising individual who's painted it. It says to me as much about the artist as it does about the human being being painted.
This is Unsettling Portraits,
Season 6 of History Lab.
a 3-part podcast series that looks closely at the history of portraiture, colonialism, and First Nations responses.
I'm Kate Fullagar.
And I'm Mike McDonnell. We are both historians of empire and its encounter with Indigenous peoples in the past.
It does bring about a bit of a nostalgic, almost sense of loss when I look at some of these things. Like I sometimes look at an image like this and just think about what did we lose?
When I actually physically saw it at the British Museum, it was like looking at the family album. And I had to be really careful not to start tearing up these watercolours at the British Museum. And it was like looking at the family album.
I love colonial failures. Yeah.
Episode 1.
Facing Empire, a long history of representing others. So, Kate, you know I'm not a big fan of portraits, but you've dragged me here to the National Portrait Gallery of Australia because there's something interesting you wanted me to take a close look at. So what's here that so intrigues you? Walk me through this.
Okay, yes. So over here, obviously, on this main wall here is one of the centerpieces of the gallery. It's the Captain Cook portrait by John Webber, kind of a founding piece of this gallery. But what I really wanted to show you was over here on this opposing wall, these 2 little prints of Bennelong.
Bennelong.
He's the man I wrote about in my last book.
You mean the main Indigenous negotiator with the colonists that came here?
Yeah, that's right. They're both drawn by colonists in the 1790s, but have a look closely. I think that there are some intriguing things to see in them.
Picture this.
Picture this. See, this first one here, painted in 1790 by the unknown Port Jackson painter.
What we have is a portrait.
It's familiar. It's very familiar to me.
It's a picture of a man.
Of this person framed in a circle.
From his waist on up.
He's looking straight at whoever is doing the artwork.
He's got very dark skin, curly hair, brown eyes. It looks like he might have some painting on his body.
With the stamp in the corner as well.
There's cursive written underneath.
British Museum of Natural History is what the stamp says, and it's in red.
It says native named Bennelong.
It says, as painted when angry.
And it's called Bennelong when angry. It shows this, front-facing, kind of defiant man, a man who's scolding his British viewer. But the second one over here drawn about 8 years later, 1798, it's got Bennelong kind of turned away from the viewer, right, and almost completely assimilated into English culture.
Those are pretty famous pictures. I've seen them so many times, but they've always looked to me to be just typical examples of the colonial gaze. To me, they both show Bennelong ripped out of context. Not really the subject of his own story, but the object of Europeans.
But they were evidently interesting to Indigenous people today. I mean, at least this first one here from 1790. Do you remember back in 2017, the Indigenous dance company Bangarra used this image to promote their show on Bennelong? And they projected a huge version of it over the pylons of Sydney Harbour Bridge. So I wonder if colonial portraits of Indigenous people can tell us more than we think.
More about the present or more about the past?
Well, both maybe. I wonder if we can learn something about the Indigenous peoples in these works and what role they might have played even in their creation.
So, Kate, I guess we should say something about ourselves.
Yes, we should, Mike. My name's Kate Fullagar. I'm an historian at ACU, an historian chiefly of the 18th century or of the modern age, and I'm particularly interested in the history of empire's interaction with Indigenous peoples.
And my name is Mike McDonnell. I'm a historian at the University of Sydney, and I'm interested in the 18th century as well, particularly Native American history and the American Revolution. My background, as far as we can ascertain, there's a little bit of English, but there's mostly Irish on both sides, displaced Irish. I was born in Wales and I grew up in Canada.
My background is that I'm first-generation Australian. My parents were both migrants. They migrated here in the 1960s, but they both came from England.
So where I grew up in Toronto was very much Anishinaabe country, and we didn't know very much about it as school kids. I don't think we ever talked about Indigenous history in high school in the 1970s and 80s, I guess.
How did we meet? I know how we met.
You've got a better memory.
Exactly, I remember everything. You were already a fancy tenured academic in the University of Sydney History Department, and I came along as a marginal postdoctoral fellow on a different floor. But you were designated as my formal mentor. That was a great lucky stroke. I think initially I thought, you are the American Revolution historian, and I'm writing about Britain. This doesn't look like we have things in common. But of course, what we have in common was the era, and then we also realised that we had very similar historical interests, actually, about empire and the excluded. How do you centre the previously uncentered? Questions like that. Of course, there is an extremely legitimate sense coming from some Indigenous readers and advisors that non-Indigenous people need to be careful when they're treading into realms of Indigenous history.
Yeah, many First Nations peoples have been asking non-Indigenous peoples to think about why they're interested in that history, to think about what they're getting out of that history, to think about the impact of that history on contemporary communities. It's not necessarily a call to abandon the field, but it's a call to kind of think deeply about why we might be doing that kind of history and what's at stake for us and what's at stake for Indigenous peoples themselves.
I still do maintain it's better to stay with the messiness and try and deal with the challenge of that. I don't want to read more histories of empire that only centres the imperialists. I want to think about how we encounter how we represent the Indigenous experience of empire intruding with as many resources as I can. That should and always will mean collaborating with Indigenous sources, Indigenous knowledge holders, but it is better than for historians of empire such as ourselves to walk away from the problem.
I agree. And the worst thing that we can do, we see this a lot, is to pay lip service to Indigenous presence at the time of contact, and then to kind of note diseases, violence, conflict, and then to, write histories as if, well, that part of the story was finished.
Yeah. I was just reflecting as you were talking about how you didn't learn about Anishinaabe in school. I think that in my schooling, which is a little bit later than your schooling, but only a touch, I think I was taught Aboriginal history, but it was always Aboriginal history that was gone and finished and over. It wasn't an Aboriginal history that had vitality into the present and that you could see all around you and should keep on engaging with. And so that's the difference that we've seen in our lifetimes. Portraits come up a lot in the source material.
Yeah, I think portraits, for a lot of us historians, occupy a very uncomfortable space because they seem to be important. We do need them for publication purposes and illustrative purposes and our PowerPoints for teaching. But I think for me personally, and I think generally, there's a sense of what to do with them, how to read them, what can we make of them? Are they just artifacts of European fantasies and imagination and questions and curiosity from Europeans themselves? Can we read them from a different sort of perspective and think with them? And
that's right.
I guess
we started to ask new questions of them, you and I, only recently. What could they reveal to us about Indigenous experiences, not just necessarily about a European tradition? And then furthermore, how can we explain a very strong, very evident interest amongst contemporary Indigenous artists in a lot of the different places that we've looked at? How can we explain their real interest in engaging with, in some ways satirising, but often themselves just really pondering the meaning of those portraits too?
Yeah.
In our quest to understand what meaning do these now old portraits have today for modern Indigenous peoples, we thought we would invite some of our Indigenous friends to talk to us about them. As some of our guests mentioned, sometimes they are the only talisman of a particular ancestor or a particular moment in time that have come down to them.
I'm a little bit surprised that you've convinced me to do this, to work on a podcast series about portraiture. As you know, I've been very reluctant to explore them because I very much see them as European produced and having very little to do with the Indigenous subjects that are portrayed in them. But I think you've convinced me that it's worth exploring it, and particularly since we're getting help, because I don't think we can do this on our own.
No.
So, join us and our amazing guests on this journey as we face empire and look at the long history of efforts to represent others and be represented through portraiture. So, Kate, I wanted to bring you back into my world in North America and to really the heartland of the Great Lakes region, a place now that is divided by the border between the US and Canada, and to think a little bit about kind of the earlier precedents for the portraits that we've been looking at of Bennelong. Because, of course, when Europeans began to move across the Atlantic and into the Americas, they were fascinated from the start by the peoples that they encountered.
That's right. And they often, portrayed their fascination in portrait form, didn't they, right from the beginning, late 15th century?
Yeah. And, of course, all of the colonizing countries had their own kind of images. And I guess one of the places and one of the traditions I've been looking at are the 17th century depictions by the Jesuits who moved to North America as part of the French colonizing experience that was religiously inspired as much as anything else. And so the Jesuits rolled through and across the Americas. They were incredibly good ethnographers, if you like, the earliest ethnographers. They were very literate and wrote extensively about their experiences in North America, particularly in what would become Canada, and wrote about their desperate efforts to kind of insinuate themselves among Indigenous peoples. But they also tried to depict them in images, and we have a series of images that are from the Codex Canadensis that was put together after the visit of one Jesuit missionary, Louis Nicholas.
Picture this. Okay, so it's a drawing of a man.
Standing more or less front on.
He's not wearing much in the way of clothes. He's got sort of like a little tiny apron
Some
thing,
kind of
like a
loincloth.
The expression on their face, it's fairly neutral.
There's some markings on the face. I don't know if that's meant to be the musculature of the face or a tattoo.
There's a headdress.
Well, it looks like it's kind of like a mohawk.
And then long hair.
I'm not sure what they're holding.
They're carrying some type of bag. Then in the right arm and going across the chest, there is a long rod. Just above it, the word pipe is written.
It's as long as a broomstick, this pipe.
It's got a cup.
And I think it's smoke coming out of the pipe. There seems to be smoke being exhaled from his mouth as well.
Top right-hand side says it's page 6, so I'm guessing it's part of a collection.
There's writing.
It looks like it's French, Sauvage de la Nation. I can't quite make out the word below that.
Utuak.
Maybe the name of the nation being referred to in the top line.
So, Kate, I thought that we would ask an Anishinaabe writer and friend of a friend, Gordon Henry, who has spent his life in the Great Lakes, about this image and whether it speaks to him at all.
Hello, Gordon. My name's Kate.
Miigwech, thank you, Kate and Michael, for inviting me. I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, I hope you didn't do too much homework, Gordon.
I did some. I looked over things. It was very helpful. And not only that, it sparked my interest to a degree that I think I'm going to do a lot more with it, more on the readings of the Jesuits, because my relatives came down to the St. Lawrence Seaway. And of course, the Jesuits were always present after the 1600s. And so our stories go back to the 1500s when we were on the coast there, and our tribe split up from there according to the migration stories. And so,
interesting.
I'm very interested because I can trace some of my ancestors back genealogically to the Quebec area, to the Anishinaabe ancestors, actually. So it's very interesting to me to read about that history.
So we've been talking a little bit about kind of earlier depictions, European depictions of Indigenous peoples in North America. And we've turned to the one that we've asked you to have a look at yourself. And we're just curious how familiar you are with this depiction.
I was not familiar with it at all. I had not done a lot of background research into these early kinds of images. I'd seen things from the 18th century mostly, and then into the 19th century were the ones I was most familiar with, because most of them were tied in with depictions of some of my ancestors. And so that's how I became familiar. Though I knew these things were out there and archived somewhere in many different places, I was not as familiar with this particular image.
So in some sense, you're coming at this relatively freshly. So I guess we're very curious then, what do you see in this image? How does it speak to you? What impression does it make?
Well, in some respects, you can see how images become sort of precursors or precede other images that have developed. For instance, the character standing, you'll see other images in the 19th and 20th century that will show a character with this sort of posed stance. And then what you also see is, I think, sort of the emphasis on certain details that must have been, under the colonial gaze, something that needed to be emphasized more for whatever reason, because it seemed exotic or foreign or something that perhaps Europeans had never seen before. And of course, those jump right to the front of the image when you're looking, this big puff of smoke, this long pipe. And those tobacco images associated with Native, of course, have continued right on into Americana, out in front of cigar store Indians and everything associated with tobacco. And so it sort of, sets the stage for product line, even in some ways, the idea of the logos on products.
Yeah. So do you think that in an image like this, which does seem so much part of the colonial gaze of the 17th century, do you think that we could still read something about what the Anishinaabe are doing? I mean, can you extract some Anishinaabe history from the image as opposed to just colonial or European history?
Well, I think one of the problems with doing that is that we rely on these sort of singular framed images over time out of the memories of Jesuits, colonizers, so to speak. And so we have this sort of displaced, isolate figure, right, that makes it somewhat difficult. I mean, you could always say that, again, like the things that we recognize here, some of the tobacco, the breechcloth, the kinds of things that might have been traditional dress among the Ottawa, we might be able to learn something from that, in particular the headpiece type of things as well. But I don't think that our Anishinaabe people or the Odawa are going to look at this and say that, these are characteristics of things that we're still doing, except for maybe the tobacco bag and the pouch and the things like that, would be familiar to us in some ways. So that's really a difficult question to answer. I think part of it has to do with There's sort of a naturalist edge to this. There's sort of a cataloging of the world that goes on here, and then the work that Nicholas was doing was, looking at animals, looking at fishing, looking at the natives. And so there was this sense that you're on this sort of scientific expedition mission in a way beyond the religious missionary function to try to show Europe what was out there, almost in like a catalog of images of the so-called New World.
You mentioned earlier that, you're more familiar with looking at 19th and 18th century sources, and then looking at the 17th century source sort of prompted more interest in researching this era for you particularly. Why do you think that it does spark interest for you to look back even further?
Well, I think it sparks interest for me because in what I've been able to find out, some of what the missionaries did does match up with some of our stories. And so it does, tell us that they were getting things right in some way. For instance, they refer to the spiritual storied beings that we still talk about today. So this makes me wonder about the images themselves. And I think it would be good for me to take these images to different tribal communities and have a conversation with them around them and see what they're seeing, it just like you're asking me.
How else might this image be useful for contemporary Anishinaabe?
Well, I think it's always good for us to talk about this in two ways. For me, one of your questions, I think, enters into how we feel. What's the effective way that these images reach out to us? And it really it fills me with a sense of wonder and loss at the same time. Like I sometimes look at an image like this and just think about what did we lose in this process? Is it that I don't know this image so well because of something that was lost in the gaps of a colonial history that had these sort of three-pronged specters, or four-pronged specters of religion, science, monarchy, and commerce? When those four things came into our world, sometimes conjointly, our lives changed, sometimes drastically for the worst under violent circumstances. And so sometimes I see something like this and I think about loss, and I also think about sort of this overemphasis on certain things on the part of Europeans as taking singular individuals as being representative of a whole group of people, magnifying certain things in their constructions of portraits and drawings that to them seemed exotic and to us may just been a part of our everyday life and wasn't exotic at all. So it does does bring about a bit of a nostalgic, almost sense of loss when I look at some of these things to feel this.
And on the other side, Gordon, is there acknowledging that sense of loss? Can we turn that around a bit and, take this image and do something positive with it?
Yes,
I don't know if that's the right word.
Absolutely. And part of the reason it's hard for us to do that is because the person who did the drawings probably wouldn't have survived if the natives weren't there. You know what I mean? A lot of the Jesuits would not have survived. And so we don't get that side of it. What would the natives have looked at if they had seen the missionaries? What might they emphasized in their view of things? Perhaps they would have emphasized them at a feast, eating food that they'd given them. You know what I mean? So it's a hard thing to flip it around. But the other side of it is that we have survived. We're still here. The colonizing effects had their effects, but they did not overtake us or overcome us. We still know our history in ways that are separate, still do things that are separate ceremonially from all this. So yeah, we take that away from it for sure. So that along with that loss, we can also speak about the resilience of people, even through this sort of compressed image making of a whole group of people.
Well, thank you,
Yeah,
Gordon.
thank you so much.
You guys are awesome. Thank you so much.
Wow, that's quite a powerful way of turning the European gaze around.
Yeah, yes, I agree.
These images seem like an important point of departure for that kind of discussion.
So another point of departure is this portrait of a Cherokee man made in 1762.
Picture this.
Now we're jumping ahead in time a little bit by about a century, but we're still with European empires in North America. This portrait was painted by the then famous Joshua Reynolds. He was the lead portrait painter of his day in London.
At first glance, it definitely appears this is a figure of great importance.
It's a male figure in the portrait.
His face looks very calm.
They've definitely got this status about them and wealth.
Someone of importance.
When I look at his clothing, I think that there's a bit of a mix of things that's happening.
The robe is red.
With the red and gold pattern.
Gold trims.
Looks like he might have silk around his shirt. There's a sense of opulence with the clothing.
It's giving colonial, but then I look at the person's face and I'm not too sure, actually, if it is.
Then if you look around the neck, there's kind of like a sash that has beadwork.
When I first saw it, I thought, oh, okay, British, like straight away. But then I'm looking at the face and I'm not seeing that.
I think he's a First Nations man. I think that that's also communicated to the viewer through the background.
The background around them looks like a forest sort of environment.
It's kind of complemented by the fact he's got this gorget that's silver hanging around his neck. And I just know from the First Nations experience in Australia that they were referred to as king plates and were given by Europeans to First Nations people to say, you are king so-and-so of the so-and-so tribe. And that seemed to be enough of a basis to negotiate with that person for access to land or to make decisions on behalf of a people.
So it's really interesting, Kate. They're quite different portraits, the 17th century image and the one of Ostenaco.
That's right. No, Joshua Reynolds has certainly tried to embed Ostenaco very much within a formal European tradition, almost as if Ostenaco was a member of a European court, whereas the earlier 17th century sketch is much more kind of ethnographic, on the spot. It has that sense of being an in situ portrayal.
Can you tell us how Ostenaco ended up in London?
Sure. Ostenaco comes from what today is called the Smoky Mountains in Cherokee country. Cherokee country in the 18th century covers mostly what we would today call North Carolina, but it covered also a little bit of South Carolina and a little bit of Virginia. In 1762, the Cherokee had just undergone nearly 2 years of a devastating war where the British had fought very hard against them and had forced the Cherokee surrender. In Cherokee country, various headmen had signed peace treaties. But what was interesting about Ostenaco is that he was one of the headmen who said, in order to really ensure this peace sticks, I want to go all the way over to the British homelands and meet your king. You've just made us sign a treaty here in this colony. I think it's only fair that we replicate that over in your homeland. So he puts his hand up to make that journey, which he does in the summer of 1762. He stays for a few months. He does actually meet the king. Along the way, though, what I don't think he would have expected was that a lot of Londoners became fascinated by the idea of a Cherokee headman in their midst. And one of those Londoners who was fascinated was the portraitist Joshua Reynolds.
I think it's really interesting, right, that there's an awareness of Cherokee power. There's an awareness of the importance of the Cherokee in North American kind of geopolitical situation. So we've got people in London who are anticipating the arrival of Ostenaco or interested in the arrival because they know what the importance of the Cherokee are.
Yep, that's right. And everyone realises that one thing that you can't afford to do is just ignore them. Whether Joshua Reynolds understood all the ins and outs of imperial policy is not clear. I think, though, looking at this portrait, it does become clear that whatever Reynolds may have thought was the situation between British colonists and Indigenous people in North America, he was a little bit undone by his meeting with Ostenaco. There's a handful of portraits that Reynolds did of the colonised people of Empire. Most of those portraits have the sitter looking away, being reasonably dominated by the kind of the portraitist's style and eye. This is the only portrait that Reynolds does of non-Europeans where the sitter is clearly looking straight out at Reynolds himself. What's fascinating to me is that Reynolds hides away this portrait and never shows it or sells it on, which is very unusual for such a commercial artist such as Reynolds. And he puts it away. And I've often wondered, Is this because this is the only Indigenous portrait that he did where the Indigenous gaze kind of got the better of him?
The gaze of Ostenaco is really quite intriguing, isn't it? It's very hard to read. I look at it and I think there's a little bit of disdain there. There's a little bit of amusement, perhaps.
Yep, disdain and amusement. It's a very powerful portrait in ways that maybe Reynolds didn't want it to be as powerful as that.
I'm excited. Let's talk. Let's do it.
Okay, so we're delighted to have with us Joseph Pierce, who's a citizen of the Cherokee Nation and is Associate Professor in the Department of Hispanic Languages and Literature at Stony Brook University.
Thanks very much for joining us, Joseph.
Hi. Thank you for this invitation. I'm grateful to be in conversation with all of you.
This episode in this podcast, we're talking about this portrait of Ostenaco, painted by one of the most famous portraitists in London at the time. Before we get into a close discussion of what this portrait means to various people, do you want to have a go at kind of describing this portrait from 1762?
As I've been thinking about this, one detail that I wanted to mention about this portrait is that it doesn't have the face tattoos. This is the thing that strikes me as the most prominent aspect, in fact, is the lack of tattoos versus some of the etchings, the engravings that were done at the same time, which do include his tattoos. And as someone who myself kind of is participating in a type of revival of certain traditional tattoos, I have lines on my fingers, and I know other Indigenous communities and other artists who have taken up facial tattoos from different contexts, that I think this painting in a way sanitizes something savage from a European perspective about this person's visage, his countenance. And I find that really striking because it's a portrait of a man wearing some things that you would expect, a gorget, a piece medal, who has a kind of shawl or a blanket draped around his shoulders. But it's the things that he's lacking that I find most interesting, the tattoos and the ochre paint. So, Kate, when you said that he was painted by, I actually wonder if he was unpainted or if there was something about him that gets left out of this, from my perspective as a Cherokee person, where it's the ochre paint that he would have adorned himself with that's left out of this historical portrait, or his face tattoos that are left out of this historical portrait.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And we do know that Ostenaco did wear his ochre paint. I mean, there are other reports of him wearing his ochre paint while he's in London and people commenting on it. So it is actually really noticeable that Reynolds thought that it was not appropriate for his portrait of Ostenaco. I thought the word that you used, sanitized, really struck me. I've often thought of this portrait as Reynolds attempting to sanitize, maybe a stereotype of a savage in his mind. But I often kind of think that it didn't actually work. So it doesn't actually work as a sort of what we might call later on a more realist or faithful portrait, but it doesn't also work that well as a sanitized, cleaned up Reynoldsian portrait either. And I wonder if that's one reason why Reynolds himself kind of puts it away and doesn't really show anyone. He doesn't think it's much of a success. When I think of that, when I think of Reynolds not liking it, when I look at the portrait, I often just look straight into Ostenaco's eyes, which I think are very powerfully painted, and wonder if it's, it's like there is a challenger to the painter and saying, you can't get this right, actually. With all the traditions of imagery and stereotypes in the artist's head, this portrait is not going to be able to be pulled off. I don't know. Do you ever get a sense of not quite rightness, a sense of it not being pulled off?
I love colonial failures. I love the idea that this is somehow a failed attempt at mastering the portrayal of Ostenaco. The tension there and the fact that he hid it from view, that he didn't display it, and that it's only much later that we're able to gaze upon this portrait allows us to imagine it as a failure, and I really love that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think about what it's like for an Indigenous person to sit for a painting as opposed to a photograph, and to sit and to be able to look at this person working and to be able to cast your gaze over the studio and the expression that the painter is making and the negotiation that has to have happened. I refuse to believe that there was no negotiation, that there was no agency involved in this, knowing what we know about someone like Ostenaco, and later what we know from the other Indigenous people who sat for these types of portraits or photographs. But I do like to imagine that there's something inscrutable in this painting that emerges in the eyes, which are truly kind of, it's hard for me to describe because I'm seeing something deep and almost aching, I want to say. Like there's a complexity of that gaze that I understand is not Ostenaco himself, right? That is Reynolds's portrayal of that. And yet, is it possible for us to theorize or to speculate that the thing that he got right, the thing that Reynolds got right, was actually the impossibility of portraying Ostenaco, which is only visible in that gaze back at himself? I think that that's wonderful. I love that. I hope that we can say that about this painting.
Gosh, this is fascinating, Joseph. I'm just, listening in awe.
I do want to say one more thing. One of the challenging things with looking at a portrait like this for a Cherokee person, for me as a Cherokee person, is that it brings up the contradictions of colonial modernity in a way that is visceral, because we're talking about a warrior and a politician and a person who painted his face red, which is an act of preparation for war that belonged to the red government. That was part of the balance of Cherokee life, being part of a war government that acted in specific moments versus a peace government that acted most of the time, but which alternated and created a sense of balance, which is crucial to Cherokee cosmological understandings. And so when I look at this and I see this person actually shorn of the red paint, it's really violent in a way. Like, it's something that was essential to his being, to like acting on behalf of Cherokee Nation. And I can't help but think about, there's a scene, I forget the name of the poet, who was the person who went to visit him that got the...
Oliver Goldsmith.
Goldsmith, right? So Goldsmith goes and this is from the various newspaper reports, right? That Goldsmith goes and meets Ostenaco and gets this red paint smudged on his cheek.
Yeah.
And I love that.
Yeah.
That he gets imprinted with this aspect of Cherokee life that he probably doesn't understand at all. And so the remnant of that red paint on Goldsmith's cheek is actually the thing that we're missing in this painting. So I like the fact that there is a record of that smudging of the paint on someone else's face, because we don't see it here. And I think that allows me to understand that Ostenaco was there and he was fighting for us, and maybe it was fighting in a political way, and maybe it was fighting in a way that we don't have from his own point of view. We don't have his testimony of what happened. But we know that he was there on behalf of Cherokee people, and I think that that's something that we can appreciate and aspire to and recall with the respect that it deserves,
Wonderful.
Terrific. Thank you, Joseph.
Wado, thank you.
So, Gordon Henry and Joseph Pearce's take on these images really help us unsettle the idea of empire and colonization. These portraits are reminders of a world we have lost, but they also make us question that history and think about it from Indigenous perspectives and what power they might have held in these relationships. And I think they've just about convinced me that these portraits are certainly worth looking at in more depth.
Well, that's good to hear, Mike, because in our next episode, we're not only going to revisit those Bennelong portraits that we opened with today, but we're also going to find out just how early Indigenous peoples themselves started to turn the gaze back on Europeans and on each other.
History Lab.